Speaking of interventionism in many different forms, but about the West interfering in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Can you talk about that?
Well, it's of a piece, isn't it? I mean, look, the
Right.
US government just released its military budget. The official budget, which was 42 or so billion dollars more than what President Biden asked for, is $858 billion. In fact, people who look at these things carefully suggest that the US military budget is really $1.5 trillion, because you got to add on, the money that goes towards the nuclear power, nuclear force, and so on. By the way, all of that is buried in the Department of Energy, or most of that is buried in the Department of Energy. United States government spends a lot of money, more than half the discretionary budget and so on. $1.5 trillion on weapons, 800 bases around the world. You can't tell me that the US government is spending this kind of money on arms for no reason. Okay. It would be illogical for a government which is finding it difficult to compete against China commercially, to use this money for its military and not to build up its infrastructure, or what Biden was bragging about. The United States is going to create a chip supply chain, silicon chips, and so on. I don't think that's going to happen. There is going to be no chip supply chain, because you're not making the necessary government investments, spending all that money on war and so on. Well, in that case, the United States understands on the global scale, it just can't compete with what it calls its near peer rivals, whether Russia or China or other countries. Soon it's going to be Brazil again. If Lula makes a left turn in Brazil, it's to be seen yet. Um, the United States can't compete with these countries commercially. You can't sell cheaper phones than the Chinese do, which is basically the same quality phone. You can't sell green technology. You don't have the 5G capacity and so on. So rather than compete with its so-called near peer rivals, commercially in the marketplace, so-called free enterprise, United States has to muscle them with its military. The military effectively is the bargaining chip that the US government has. And that's what it's been using against Russia in the last several years. It's been trying to use its military power to pressure Russia, using the so called security umbrella around Europe to cut Europe's buying of Russian energy. Trump went and told the Europeans that when he was in Europe just before he left office. So the war in Ukraine, it's not about human rights, it's not about democracy. I don't even think for the Russians it's really about denazification. The war is really a contest between the United States wanting to dominate Europe and Russia wanting to sell its energy to anybody. I mean, the Russians sold 1/3 of Germany's imports came from Russia. That's what Russia was interested. It was a commercial arrangement. Russia was not seeking to take over Europe. It was just selling energy all over Europe. And the United States found that disagreeable. Why? Because the Atlantic Alliance was being threatened. The United States simply didn't have the capacity to compete with Russian natural gas. They want to sell liquefied natural gas, much more expensive than gas that comes piped through Nord Stream 2. So this mentality in Washington, you can't fight them with your capitalism, so you have to fight them with your imperialism. And that's the reason why the United States simply will not allow a peace negotiation to take place in Ukraine. Hillary Clinton said it, on a TV show earlier this year. You probably played a clip in one of your shows, Katie, because it was so bizarre, where she said, well, Ukraine is going to be Putin's Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Firstly, that's a grotesque misreading of what happened to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was basically assassinated by Gorbachev and people like Yeltsin. The Afghan war, of course, was a drag on the Soviet economy, but didn't bring it down. There's a fantasy that somehow this war is going to create regime change in Ukraine. I just like to remind people in Washington, D.C., that Mr. Putin, whether you like it or not, has actually mined a strain of deep Russian chauvinism, which Lenin had warned about 100 years ago, to his advantage. And, the Russians are now quite fundamentally behind Putin. the protests have basically disappeared. Combination perhaps of some repression, but also because they've been able to mobilize this immense seam, this mine, gold mine of patriotism and nationalism. Putin has used that. There's going to be no regime change in Russia. You're not going to see it happen. So the Ukrainians are bleeding. That's why I wrote that piece, because I'm concerned that I feel people don't understand that this contest over Europe is going to be a bill paid by the Ukrainian people. And if you really feel for the Ukrainians, you must fight to end this conflict. It's going to be for nobody's good, least of all the Ukrainians.